Before we get started, I have a quick favor. I've been self-funding the Finding Genius podcast for 5 years now. I've done over 3,000 episodes. And as you can see on YouTube, we're up over 1 million views on the channel, which is fantastic. The next thing I really want to push on is to get up to 10,000 subscribers. Because once we do, we'll be able to put a donate button and we'll be able to solicit donations to help keep the podcast running and to also get the Finding Genius Foundation moving along. We have a big project studying anxiety, depression, and PTSD and working on a product to help people overcome these problems because I've seen them explode recently after the last 2 years of the whole virus situation. So if you would, please subscribe to the podcast. That would help us tremendously. Give us a thumbs up and check in the description for Buy Me a Coffee. It's about $5. If you could buy me a coffee, I'd really appreciate it. It would help keep the channel going, and I love coffee. Thank you.
Forget frequently asked questions.
Common sense, common knowledge, or Google.
How about advice from a real genius? 95% of people in any profession are good enough to be qualified and licensed. 5%
go above and beyond.
They become very good at what they do, but only
0.1%
are real geniuses. Richard Jacobs has made it his life's mission to find them for you. He hunts down and interviews geniuses in every field: sleep science, cancer, stem cells, ketogenic diets, and more. Here come the geniuses. This is the Finding Genius Podcast
with Richard Jacobs.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Finding Genius Podcast and the Good Question Podcast. My guest today, I think, promises to be very interesting. Donald Summers. He's an author of a new book called Scaling Altruism, a proven pathway for accelerating nonprofit growth and impact. So welcome, Donald.
Thanks for having me on the show, Rich. Glad to be here.
Yeah, I'm really curious about this subject because nonprofits, I would think the public thinks all kinds of strange things about them, and the reality is probably very, very different. So I'm looking forward to learning what the reality is of nonprofits and how hard it is to run them and grow them. So, thanks for coming again.
Glad to be here, and I'm still learning, but delighted to share what the last 25 years in this space have taught us.
Great. Well, tell me, the audience too, a bit about your background, how you got to work in and with nonprofits and, run your own perhaps.
I grew up, as I write in the foreword of my book, very suspicious of business principles. When I was born, I'm a Gen X kid, born right around the time MLK and Kennedy was assassinated, and I grew up, scared of the Cold War. And when that went away, we then became scared of climate change and, pollution and all these externalities they're known of big businesses. And, I grew up in a family with a lot of business people, and I wanted to go another direction. So I was very idealistic, and I ended up teaching and then getting into nonprofits. But I had this, real light bulb moment in grad school. I studied literature and art and religion in college and, a lot of the artsy stuff, and I loved it. But then when I came across accounting, finance, law, business practices, I was, 28 years old in my graduate program, and I said, holy cow, this is how the world works. What if we could use these tools for good? And that kicked off a career where I went into the social sector, but with these very robust business practices. And as I found later in my doctoral program, and after working with many, many nonprofits, hundreds around the world of all sizes and shapes, there's a deep suspicion, like the suspicion I held, for these business tools and methodologies because of the way that the tools are used to oppress people and extract resources and trash the planet. And what I discovered is these tools aren't immoral, they are amoral, and they can be used for good. And that kicked off my career of using MBA style, and again, it's not just private sector. These are organizational practices that are independent of tax status and mission. It's how to build teams to scale things up and accomplish a hard goal. And whether you're trying to make money or house the homeless or solve addiction or reforest the planet, these tools and these practices I discovered over many years of trial and error are all the same. And there's some minor differences, but what I'm on a mission, Rich, is to, let the nonprofit folks know that don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. There's all these books and all these concepts and principles that try to reinvent the wheel. And we know exactly how to scale up and solve social problems. But what I discovered is that the literature's got this big gap There's all these books that try to explain these management and these financial principles in ways that don't offend the social sector people. And then they end up using this new language, and then you get this lost in translation issue. So that's one problem.
But my guess is that people that start and or work in nonprofits probably think that what they do is different. It's not traditional for-profit business. So therefore, they would probably automatically reject or be suspicious of anything that comes from the normal business world as, no, that's not going to work for us. Like
that's
exactly
right. That's exactly right. There's a couple of things. I call that the myth of uniqueness, that, your tax. And again, look at the name of the sector, nonprofit. It's actually totally wrong and inaccurate. You're supposed to make as much profit as possible so you can do more good. You're just not distributing that profit to shareholders. You're driving it back into your mission. So the way the branding and the whole culture, and again, but there's some nonprofits that don't have this problem, Rich. You look at our public university system, even our private universities, these are mostly nonprofits. They're the highest performing institutions in the world. These are major global international corporations doing incredible things to discover and apply new science and learning and health and you name it. They're all nonprofits, right? How about our hospitals? They're nonprofits, right?
Oh, I didn't know that.
The NFL is
they don't seem like
nonprofit before they got embarrassed and changed their corporate status, right? So some nonprofits, the big ones, or legacy organizations like the Metropolitan Museum or the Smithsonian, major cultural organizations, those are nonprofits. They often are run exactly like high-performing any type of company.
There's also, well, at least from my perspective, a darker side to this, and I hate to say it, but I'm not going to name names, but there are certain people that are, in the public eye that have nonprofits, and I consider some of these people just plain evil. And I think, why would this person have a nonprofit? There must be some tax or other advantage or way to clean up their reputation. That's why they have it, because I just don't see them having it because they actually care about people and want to help.
Oh, of course.
I know it's a horrible thing to say.
It's not a horrible thing to say. It's accurate. Sorry, I didn't mean to bite off the end of your sentence. That's called reputation laundering, and it's common among corporations who, you take a big corporation. Let's take an easy target, like a big oil company, and they'll have a foundation that gifts to kids with cancer, and it's trying to show they're trying to have a halo effect. Now that's a simplistic example, but the nonprofit universe, to take a step back, Rich, it's 6 or 7% of our economy. It's $2.5 trillion sector. There's a tremendous amount of variety. Okay. And there's big companies and small. There's millions of small, tiny nonprofits that you are 100% correct are often caught. They're well-meaning people with fantastic programs, but they're struggling to keep their doors open because they are suspicious of these management principles. Those are the folks I'm trying to reach. There's big companies that are nonprofits that are doing great work. There's some nonprofits that are scams, boiler room operations. They're firemen for children's cancer. All they are is call centers that are bilking seniors out of donations, and they spend 98% of their financing to send to their fundraisers, right? So but they're a very small percentage of the field. So it's a wild and woolly sector that goes under this weird name. But here's the thing. Here's the upside. If we can take a small section of the million or so nonprofits whose annual budgets are $500,000 a year, these are our community centers, our child care agencies, these are our advocacy groups, our social justice organizations. If we can show them a proven breadcrumb trail, a pathway for growing their impact, we can unleash a wave of social progress the country's never, ever seen before. And I believe that because we've done it with a great variety of small nonprofits using this toolkit. So, the background, the context of this work is extraordinarily diverse and complex. And what my career and my entire life, my whole purpose is to do as much social good as possible by giving these growth and impact tools to these small to mid-sized nonprofits so they can go from, survival to success.
Are a lot of these small nonprofits you're talking about, are they like mom and pops of the nonprofit world, and are they run that way?
Well, this is true with everything. So, when you take a step back, you realize that among for-profit businesses, only 4% are bigger than $1 million a year. Yeah, 75%. Absolutely. 75% of employment in the United States are small businesses, mom and pop businesses, right? But
Like what I've noticed about, let's say restaurants, the chains, yes, they have systems, they have uniforms, they have this, that, and the other, but their food's, ugh. And then you go to the mom and pops, the food may be great, but they have no systems, they're a mess, they don't answer their phone, they're just, I just wish there was like a middle ground, and probably in business it's the same thing.
Now you're on the crux of the matter. Scaling anything at quality is hard, but here's the difference. To scale a restaurant or a dry cleaning business or anything, any enterprise for a nonprofit is hard, but the for-profit sector has a massive ecosystem of support. You got MBA programs, you've got the VC markets, you've got the capital markets, you've got mentor programs, you've got hundreds of business accelerators, you've got a rich literature of terrific books. The nonprofit sector is so vital, but there's gaps in the literature. There are only a handful of very small accelerators. There's no capital markets. The revenue is distributed over 6 different domains. It's hard to measure results. You have to be very clear. So there's a range of barriers for the small mom and pop nonprofits to scale that your for-profit nonprofits don't confront. And that's where we're filling the gap.
Before we continue, I've been personally funding the Finding Genius podcast for 4.5 years now, which has led to 2,700 plus interviews of clinicians, researchers, scientists, CEOs, and other amazing people who are working to advance science and improve our lives and our world. Even though this podcast gets 100,000 plus downloads a month, we need your help to reach hundreds of thousands more worldwide. Please visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click on Support Us. We have 3 levels of membership from $10 to $49 a month, including perks such as the ability to see ahead in our interview calendar and ask questions of upcoming guests, transcripts of podcasts you're interested in, the ability to request specific topics or guests, and more. Visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click Support Us today. Now back to the show.
Okay, so what are some of these barriers that are common?
Well, to nonprofits, for-profits, or every type of...
nonprofits, like mom and pop nonprofits, to be able to first survive and then scale.
Well, you've got to get over the myth of uniqueness, right? You have to understand that you're running a organization that, I don't want to call it a business because many small businesses, as you already pointed out, aren't run well. You have to work on the company, not just in the company. You have to access the management skills, the tools, and the practices to grow your organization to the size you want it to be, right? And that involves a very specific set of tools. And nonprofits, just like their for-profit mom and pops, are founded by subject matter experts, right? So those restaurant owners that have the great food, they don't have MBAs. They don't know how to scale up a chain of quality. And your daycare center founder or your homeless shelter founder, these are altruists. They're wonderful people. And they quickly realize that just keeping the doors open is difficult because they have a board, they need financial projections, they've got to report metrics to their funders, they've got foundation funding, they've got corporate partners, they have to raise money, they get stuck in these doom loops around these auctions and galas that they're socialized to pursue. So there's a whole range of myths that they got to get over. Many of the current practices that these small nonprofits use to survive will keep them small, right? You want to stay small and struggle with hand-to-mouth existence, run events for your revenue, right? Guaranteed to keep you small. Now, events are important, but you've got to understand that the revenue growth is a very sophisticated domain. And what's frustrated the heck out of me and all my clients is the literature on it isn't clear enough, and it doesn't say, here's not just what to do, but here's how to do it. And here are templates. And we're going even further. We're not just giving people a step-by-step pathway to raise money and measure your programs and run a high-performing board and scale up your growth and impact. All the organizational problems that every small nonprofit confronts, instead of looking across the literature and figuring out this domain and that domain and that domain, what we've done is taken 20 years to put it all together in one integrated package where is one-stop shopping for your nonprofit leaders to say, do it like this, in this order, with these tools that any mission can plug into.
All right, so if I had 2 businesses, if I had a coffee house, and one was a regular for-profit, one was a nonprofit coffee house, same business, same everything, how much harder would it be for me to operate the nonprofit coffee house just because it's a nonprofit?
there's advantages and disadvantages to each model, and it depends on what your goals are, right? And this is the thing. For one of the first things we teach, your corporate structure is it's a choice. It should be a part of your overall growth and impact strategy, right? Some of our clients, like my firm, I have a for-profit LLC, which is really just a social enterprise, and I have a nonprofit foundation to give the tools away, right? Many organizations, take OpenAI, it's a for-profit owned by a nonprofit. Your corporate structure is a tool. So 2 coffee shops, right? 1 for-profit, nonprofit, there should be an intentional reason why that corporate structure is there. So if you have a coffee shop, for example, that employs a formerly homeless population or the formerly incarcerated, right? And it seeks to, here in Seattle, we have Fair Start that employs restaurant staff that were from vulnerable populations, incredibly successful, right? And it's a nonprofit, but it makes millions of dollars. It's a choice, right? It's not a destiny. And again, the nonprofit sector is the point that I make with every breath. Is held back by these myths and assumptions which aren't true. And it's held back by a lack of access to proven processes that break down the barriers. Still isn't easy.
But what about maybe some of the, and I don't know if this is the case. So if you have a nonprofit, in order to keep that status, you have to have a certain percentage of or amount of donations. So, like let's say, again, I have a coffee house, 2 coffee houses, one will hire people that were incarcerated and one's just a regular one. So the one that hires, formerly incarcerated people, let's say the whole business runs exactly the same as the for-profit one runs, but do I have this extra onus now where I have to get a certain amount of donations or I lose my status?
Nope.
Like, does that cause problems?
Nope. This being the United States, you can do a lot with any type of company. It's incredibly wide open. Now there's certain things that you need to do. Right? The fundamental difference between a for and a nonprofit is you can make all the money you want from all the earned income initiatives you want, right? And as long as the money that you're making is part of your mission, a nonprofit has advantages. Like you don't have to pay excise taxes, right? In a lot of cases, right? Now I have to warn my audiences, I'm not giving tax advice and I'm not a lawyer. Consult your own professional, right? But you can run a nonprofit entirely on earned income. You can also get contributed income in the form of gifts and grants. You can get debt capital at reduced rates of risk and interest. That's called impact capital. The financing available in nonprofits it's huge that for-profits might not be able to get, right? No one gives a for-profit free money in many ways, right?
Right.
So again, there's a lot of details here and it's hard to sum it up, but you have to first of all, these are all downstream decisions. You first have to say, what problem am I solving, right? And this is why we talk about in the book, we talk a number of practices that, first of all, anchor your work to, these guideposts that then enable all these other decisions to happen. When you jump in and say, I should be a nonprofit or for-profit without making those decisions, you end up struggling and sometimes making the wrong decision. So again, there's a lot of nuance around this and it's hard to, sum it up in a couple of pithy phrases, but you're asking great questions. And what we're doing is we're unpacking already, a lot of the myths about, nonprofits. And, you can pay your executives a ton of money as a nonprofit. Mm-hmm. Now there's a barrier called excess compensation, right? You can't pay them billions, but you can, university presidents, heck, the highest paid nonprofit people in the United States are? You know who they are?
University presidents? I don't know.
There's people who make, you're close. There's people who make way more money than university presidents. Hospital executives tend to. Even more so, the football coaches, right? They make there's one guy down in, I think it was A&M, who got a $70 million buyout, right? That there's a big scandal about it. So you'd be amazed what some people try to get away with under the nonprofit guys and what's allowable. And on top of that, Rich, what's crazy is there's very little enforcement in the space. Look at the shenanigans Donald Trump was pulling under his charity, right? And there's a classic example of someone who's savvy enough and manipulative enough to, not to get political here, but he's going to wring all the benefits he can out of every corporate nook and cranny, and he's going to take advantage of the lack of enforcement. So again, there's lots of stuff, lots of detail there. I hope I'm not getting in the weeds.
No problem. Any case studies come to mind that would elucidate some of these myths and show you what's really possible?
I'm glad you asked. So I write one in my book, right? So
let's do a different one so we still get people to be excited to read the book.
Sure. Well, some of the most high, here's the thing. There's a small number of very high impact, high growth nonprofits that had started from nothing and have done amazing things, right? And it's not just amazing amounts of social good. And I'll start with an example that's not even a nonprofit. It's a for-profit with a social mission. These are called social enterprises, founded by this incredibly humble guy who happens to be a genius. His name is Ned Tozun, and he founded an organization called D-Light, D-Light. And he got the brilliant idea to replace kerosene lamps in developing countries with solar lamps. And by doing so, he detoxified these austere environments. They're often mud huts. And these cooking fires were creating toxic smoke that were hurting the families and the kids. And then they needed the lighting. And by introducing these low-cost, robust solar lights that didn't rely on a centralized electrical grid, he's built a multi-million-dollar company that is attracting investment and is having incredible benefits. And, so again, there's no clear off and on switch between a for-profit and a nonprofit. There's actually a spectrum with lots of shades of gray, right? You can have some nonprofits with the evil heart of a corporation and some corporations with the heart of a nonprofit, right? Tax status is not determinative. You can have hybrid organizations like D-Light. And my favorite examples are the small nonprofits led by true altruists who have the heart of a charity, the brains and the drive and the practices of a high-growth, high-performing organization. A classic example is Teach for America. Wendy Kopp, a woman my age, in Princeton, wrote this thesis that we want to get these, our best and brightest into public schools. They've had tremendous impact. You've got KIP, you've got City here, you've got a number of doing incredible work with low-income inner-city kids. You've got the Harlem's Children's Zone. Jeff Canada, brilliant man, has transformed the entire social sector of Harlem with this comprehensive social safety, educational, medical programs. There's so many brilliant stories out there, Rich. What there isn't is a playbook, I believe, that really can make it easy for people. There's some okay books out there, and I'm not trying to disparage the rest of the literature, but I saw a gap. So what I'm trying to do is enable, these are geniuses, the Wendy Kopps, the Jeff Canadas, the KIP founders. They're brilliant people. You have Education Superhighway, another organization that closes the digital gap for millions of kids, founded by a Harvard MBA. These are people that we need more of these people, and they need more support. They need more ecosystems. They need a better guide.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, are there consultants for people that want to, evaluate what structure they should have, based on their idea? Or are those not even the right people because they're just not knowledgeable enough to steer you in the right way?
The joke about consultants, right? Ask a consultant what time it is, and they ask to look at your watch, and then they steal your watch, right? And I don't mean to disparage consultants. I am one, right? I am a management consultant, but the management consulting industry is like any other industry. There's a small number of very high-performing people. The bulk of the population is filled with mediocrity, and then there's some bad actors, right? There's a distribution. I don't know if you read the book about McKinsey and Company. When McKinsey comes to town,
That was terrible.
Yeah, those vampires out of these Ivy Leagues, vampires in Ivy League suits ripping off America and the government, So consulting's getting a bad name from people like that. But, here's my read of the landscape. And again, I have a very small boutique consultancy. I'm a small consultant, and there's thousands of professionals like me serving nonprofits, and we're good people, right? We're trying to do our best to help these organizations, and I've met dozens of very capable people. However, the uncomfortable truth remains that the best consultants tend to go all the money, and the money ain't in the small nonprofit space. Secondly, there's so many things that a small nonprofit executive needs to do well. Most consultants are niche experts. They're either fundraisers or marketers or government experts or evaluation professionals. Very few people play the whole keyboard. So, that's where I've tried to distinguish our practice is, look, this is everything you need, all in the right place. And I hope all the consultants read my book. I've open sourced the methodologies through my a nonprofit, the tools are out there. You Google business plan template, you'll see a bunch of stuff that most of it's mediocre at best. None of it will help a small nonprofit pass due diligence with a sophisticated investor. So we built a better one. And, am I going to keep that and try to make as much money as I can? Hell no. I hope the consultants, nonprofit consultants, will join my community and learn the skills so they can further propagate it. So I love consultants. We want to help. And, they're a crucial ingredient to our vision of transforming the social sector in the U.S. and around the world.
Yeah, I should have asked you this at the beginning. I don't know if you thought about this. So nonprofit, again, is a misnomer, and 501c3 or registered charity is probably even worse of a misnomer. Would you call these organizations that would more accurately reflect what they are? Is there a better name for them?
Thought many years about that. I like social impact enterprise. And I actually use that term in my book, and I juxtapose the type of thinking and the terms used between a charity. A charity says gift. A charity says theory of change. A social enterprise will say investment. It will say business strategy.
A charity says to me, we're broke, please donate to us. It's like they ring the bell at Christmas time for the Salvation Army, please help us because we're about to go under every second. And, all of your donations, we're about to fall apart. That's what it says to me, unfortunately. But.
Well, and here's a funny thing. The Salvation Army is run extremely well. You know what they say at the Salvation Army? We make a nickel scream, right?
Okay.
I've met some extremely competent Salvation Army executives, and I have a lot of admiration for that nonprofit. But you're 100% right. The begging for pennies, right? So we talk about social return on investment. We don't talk about need. We talk about opportunity, right? We never use guilt. We talk about how we can, live our best lives and express the true meaning. We talk about, I don't care if you've got money, you're successful, big deal, right? All that, Elon Musk is not a significant person. He's a successful one. And you could argue that he's made some significant impacts through, decarbonizing the grid. But, for all these people that pursue money, so many of them end up setting up these charitable foundations. There's now 100,000 of them. It's become a mark of social stature to give back, So again, it's a mixed bag. We believe that you're absolutely right. We need more nuanced thinking in the space, and I wrote a big chapter in my book that explores all these themes and ended up cutting it out because it's got too distracting. I understand.
Are you going to add it as a bonus chapter?
Yeah, I got it sitting around. I explore the sources of the myth of uniqueness, the cultural antecedents behind why, I think Dan Pallotta's book on Charitable is now a documentary film, does an amazing job of why we think about charities different. There's a brilliant book called Charity for All by the former CEO of NPR, brilliant thinker by the name of Ken Stern, about why charities are struggling and breaking promises. And there's so much interesting stuff out there. I'm trying to stay focused. These nonprofit executives that we reach on this podcast are busy people. They have their attention deficit, struggling, with information overload like us all, right? And I wanted to strip the book of everything that wasn't critically necessary to make the missions more powerful, to achieve a mission, not just pursue it, in vain. So we really stripped down and focused, extremely lean and practical guidance for the time-starved executive. And all this context is incredibly useful and powerful. But bottom line is we've got tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of extremely generous, public-minded altruists, right? People who put the good of others before themselves. And they're trying to run these organizations and they don't have the tools to do it. And they're doing their best. It's amazing what we can accomplish already, right? The United States, in our country, the social sector is a huge chunk of our economy. It's how we keep our communities afloat. And there's so much more we can do to make it. That's my message.
Okay. I just wanted to tell a quick story about the power of some of these organizations. I think that's why I brought up Salvation Army. My mom grew up incredibly poor, and she remembers the Salvation Army helping her family and giving them food or clothes or whatever it was. And, otherwise they would have starved. So, she passed away, but until the end of her life, she would always donate to them. And she never forgot the kindness they gave her, even 70 years later. So good organizations that help people. I mean, I don't think that's forgotten. And that could be literally just for decades, the goodwill could extend based on what I've seen from my mom.
Well, and that's great that you grew up with that culture. There's another wonderful book called The Generosity Crisis, and it explores the reason why so many people, and my friend and colleague Nathan Chappell and his colleagues wrote this book, charitable donations are plunging in the last 10 years in the United States. 3/4 of the U.S. population, as recently as 10 years ago, were giving to charity, and that number is down to half now. And when you asked the Better Business Bureau the results of its survey, they asked a very broad spectrum of Americans whether they trusted nonprofits to use donations well. You know what the percentage who came back and said yes? 1 in 4. So the other flip side to this is, the nonprofit sector is looking at some serious threats right now. And the big universities and hospitals have a big fat balance sheet. They're okay. Now, that's not to say many smaller universities and hospitals aren't struggling, but, there's some serious threats to the charitable landscape when we hear about people abusing charities for their own gain. And I'll go back to my earlier examples, these boiler room operations, or these are the reputation laundering that's happening. When you get charities that are constantly begging for money and harassing people, there's this movement called Give Big, which I absolutely think is well-meaning, but a terrible idea. It encourages all these charities to ask for money at the same time. And all it does is create donor fatigue, right? And it's just emailing people constantly for money and asking people constantly for money on social media. You're overwhelmed with the need and you don't have enough money to support it all. I mean, it's no wonder charitable receipts are going down, because there's a great population of charities that treat people like cash machines. They just send out emails asking for money. And what we do is we guide, and I'm not the only person that does this, but if you guide nonprofits to build authentic relationships with supporters that add meaning, it's not transactional, it's transformational. If you actually treat people like human beings and get them involved in your mission and communicate with empathy, that takes time and expertise, and it takes training. But when you do that, the organizations that we show how to do this grow on average. And here's the big kicker, Rich. When nonprofits follow this methodology, they grow a median of 25% a year in their revenue and their impact.
Wow.
And that's a banging growth rate even for a private sector company, right? When we say this is proven, we're not joking around, and we have a long list of dozens and dozens of deployments. Not every client chooses to follow the methodology because it's not easy. You got to eat your broccoli and do your daily exercise, right? You've got to follow the protocols and the practices. But when you have disciplined, optimistic, resilient, focused leadership that's coachable, that can find the bandwidth, right? You remember Abraham Lincoln, and I write about this in my book, tells a story, says, if you give me 6 hours to chop down a tree, I'm going to spend 4 of those hours sharpening my axe. And I encounter all these nonprofit executives that are barely keeping their nose above the waves and like, I don't have time to learn this stuff. And I'm like, you're just choosing to struggle. You got to find the time. Otherwise, you're not going to get out of struggle town. You're going to be on the struggle bus. Sharpen your axe, right?
A bit of brass tacks for a minute. So some organizations, again, I don't know these numbers exactly, but I've heard some of the bad nonprofits, like 98 cents out of every dollar, like you say, goes to either the executives that run it and or the marketing to get new money, while other ones, I'm sure it's a much more favorable percentage. Is there a sweet spot, or does that percentage matter of how much of someone's donation that goes towards actually the mission of the organization? What should it be? What could it be?
Well, that's another myth. And for years, and this is still a powerful myth, it's very destructive. It's called the overhead myth, that fundraising and administrative expenses, if they're too high, funders and philanthropists and corporations are saying, what's the percentage that you spend on programs versus, overhead? And they're trying to, set some arbitrary figure like 15%. And many government programs deliberately starve the agencies that they fund by limiting those indirect costs, right? Now, a university puts a 50% tax on any grants that any of its professors get just to keep the lights on, right? And nobody says boo to that. So the answer is there's no set number. Now, if you see an organization like those very small number of evil, quote unquote nonprofits that spend 98% of their money on fundraising, yeah, that's probably an indicator that these are bad actors. But early stage nonprofits that are very high growth might spend in their, first days, 30 or 40 or 50% of every dollar they raise might be spent on fundraising. Now, we have a metric called the cost per dollar. When you have a mature fundraising organization that's doing very good work and it's efficient and effective, the cost per dollar, they should spend around 15 cents for every dollar they raise. And that's a good efficiency metric. And they should be able to explain their cost per dollar and where they're driving it. And they should have that as a key performance indicator. Many small nonprofits don't even know what that is. They don't track it. But that's one example of overhead that can be a useful indicator when you're just looking at the fundraising enterprise. When you're looking at the programs, there is no overhead, right? The HR, the leadership, the operations, even the fundraising shouldn't be looked at overhead because it's all necessary to deliver impact. So these easy measures run by people that really don't know, nonprofit finance, people are looking for these simple numbers. You've got to be a very sophisticated executive or expert to really read an organization's balance sheet, their dashboard, their program impacts. And the fact is, it's very hard. It often can be hard to tell. Some organizations will, even if you did have a number, you can play games with the accounting and allocate costs. So there's no simple way, apart from one very simple way of telling if an organization's doing good. You can tell, right? The numbers are right in front of your face. For example, when you talk about foster youth, and this is what I write about in my book, when you say foster youth, at the time I did this work with Janice Avery, the genius executive and, just wonderful leader at Treehouse, foster youth were graduating at 40%, 60% dropout rate. And they say, we're going to fix that. Their peers are graduating at 80%. And we're going to take the entire population of kids in this major metropolitan area, over 2,000, in this region, and we're going to take their graduation rate from 40% to 80%. Amazing social transformation, very easy to measure and tremendously significant. When you find a nonprofit with clear impact numbers like that you can't fake, like you can't, you either graduate from high school or you don't, and the school district has those numbers. This organization in 5 years did it, and it was my joy to work with them, and that's the case study that helped inspire this book. And that example is what we've been reproducing in the dozen years since we had that engagement. So you can tell social impact because it's clear, it's concrete. You don't care about if you have to peel back the onion and it's not clear, well, then your chances are good that you don't have a high-performing organization. When you have a nonprofit says, this is the problem we're solving, here's what success looks like, here's how we measure it. It's unambiguous, it's concise, it's concrete, very, very clear, it's easy to measure, and we're going to move the needle on this. And, then when you do that, it takes a tremendous amount of hard work to make things simple like that. The famous French mathematician Blaise Pascal said, I'm sorry I wrote you such a long letter. I didn't take the time to make it short, right? So you got to take the time to make your programs clear, transparent, and accountable. If you do that and you really truly have impact that's best in class, you can get to scale. So that's a big part of our methodology, is helping organizations get to that. So, if you have to ask hard questions with a lot of ambiguous numbers, you've already lost the fight.
Gotcha. It's probably, this question came to mind earlier, but based on what you said, it's probably unnecessary, but unusual corporate structures, I've never seen one run on sortition, but are you familiar with the term? Is there any point in nonprofits experimenting with exotic ways of how they're run that are not traditional, that, I guess the best models for them to run well are the models that work for regular for-profit businesses. But have you seen any unusual, governance models that work better?
Oh yeah, we've seen everything. Well, not everything. We continue to be surprised by life, which is one of the things that makes life worth living. Again, just because you have a tax status doesn't mean you should be run differently. And how you run, there's a variety of choices, right? So you might choose to have a quote unquote flat layer of management, right? But there should be a reason behind it, and you should have people who've done it successfully before leading the effort, right? You get into trouble when people latch onto these ideas and they haven't really done it before and nobody's there to guide them, or they don't really invest in doing it well. So I've seen nonprofits, I've seen for-profits with exotic management structures. Look at OpenAI. They ran into a serious governance failure, right? The board board tried to oust the CEO fired the board. I mean, that was a mess. So this is not a problem unique to nonprofits. This is a problem unique to getting a bunch of, primates to work together as a team. It's not easy. So again, we have a chapter on leadership and how to structure. We've boiled it down to one page. There's 10 things that a board member does, that a CEO does, that a manager does, and that a staff person does. And there's 10 swim lanes. Everybody's in each swim lane and has a slightly different stroke, right? And you can name them with a couple of words, right? So there's entire books written on this topic, which nobody has time to read. And you can hire a governance expert and you can hire these HR experts. And what we've done after confronting the same problem 500 times is say, look, we got to get it down to one page, make it unambiguous, and, follow this chart. And when people get that type of direction, they're released. They're like, oh, thank you. And they just want the answers. They want to know just these vague, ambiguous what to do. They want to know how to do it. And they got to know that they got to have confidence that the guidance works. So that's how we try to cut through all this noise.
Okay, excellent. It's been a really great call. I think it's fantastic and very interesting. In addition to reading your book, let's first of all restate the title, tell people where they can get it. Once they read the book, then what do they do? If they really want to take action from there.
It's Scaling Altruism. All you got to do is Google those two words. It pops right up on your local bookstore or your, bookseller that you prefer. They're all over it's all over the world. And then at the end of every chapter in the book, there's templates, there's case studies, there's specific terms and examples, there's a glossary. It's a whole toolkit. But that's not enough. So at the end of every chapter, it points you to a website, the Altruist Accelerator, altruistaccelerator.org. And what that is, it's a community for people who want help applying the principles in the book. Just like a business accelerator, but it's self-paced, it's extremely low cost, it's $79 a month to join the community, it's open only to staff and volunteers of nonprofits. It's a very short application. It's all self-paced, and it's a community of nonprofit folks that come together to apply these practices and support each other. And that launches August 1. So I've spent many years writing the book and many months designing the technology platform. There's videos, there's how-tos, there's templates, but most importantly, there's nonprofit people. I don't want to teach nonprofit people this. I want the nonprofit people to become teachers, right?
Gotcha.
The critical element is, there's so much we've learned from history. Benjamin Franklin said, tell me and I forget. Teach me and I may remember. Involve me and I learn. So that's what's more than the book. I want to involve people to teach each other and involve them in each other's, supporting each other and commenting on each other's business plans and KPIs and revenue strategy and governance models, and a place where they can come vent and say, how do I solve this? There's no format that is low cost, that's global, that gives comprehensive, robust advice. And so we're trying to fill that gap. So Altruist Accelerator, the book is, you can read the book and you'll get a lot out of it. And the book can be a valuable resource by itself, but it's this community that we're trying to build that we think has potential to really scale up. And one day maybe we can start reaching more and more of the nonprofit sector.
Okay. Well, Donald, thanks. This has been a great interview. I love it. I highly encourage people to check out the book, Scaling Altruism. And thank you so much for coming.
Well, thank you for all you do. Your own story and your own work makes the world a better place. So thanks for being a fellow altruist. And thanks again for having me on.
Excellent.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
You've been listening to the Finding Genius podcast with Richard Jacobs. If you like what you hear, be sure to review and subscribe to the Finding Genius podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And want to be smarter than everybody else? Become a premium member at findinggeniuspodcast.com. This podcast is for information only. No advice of any kind is being given. Any action you take or don't take as a result of listening is your sole responsibility. Consult professionals when advice is needed.